Talent gets you to the door. That is all it was ever going to do. It opens it, politely, quietly, and then it stands there, waiting for something else to take over. Talent does not walk through. Talent cannot finish the job. Grinding is what takes the door off its hinges. Anyone with a little natural ability gets the door open. That part is almost easy. That is why so many people stop there, standing in the doorway, mistaking the opening for the arrival. The ones who actually get in are the ones who kept going after the door opened, who treated the opening as the beginning, not the reward. That distinction changes everything about what happens next. Natural ability without effort behind it gets you noticed at the entrance and nowhere past it. The hinges only come off through repetition. Hours nobody is watching. Effort that has nothing to do with how naturally talented the starting point was. So the door is open. That is good. That was never the hard part. The hard part is everything that comes after standing in that doorway.
The rank means something to look at. A number, a title, proof that something was earned. But nobody wants to talk about what it cost to get there. The repetitions before the rank are where the rank actually gets built. 10,000 of them. Unremarkable, repetitive, boring enough that most people quit somewhere in the first few hundred. Nobody sees those. Nobody applauds those. There is no rank attached to repetition number 4,000. Just the work, done again and again. That invisibility is exactly why most people never get past it. Effort without recognition feels pointless in the moment. It only becomes meaningful once the rank shows up at the end of it. But the rank was never the actual accomplishment. The 10,000 repetitions were. The rank is just the label put on them after the fact. So, if the rank is the goal, the repetitions are the entire path to it. Skip enough of them, and the rank simply never arrives. That math has never changed for anyone. The system does not check how tired the effort feels. It does not pause to consider exhaustion. It does not lower the requirement out of sympathy. Whatever is being faced outside of you operates exactly the same way. Exhaustion has never once lowered the requirement. Tired is real. The feeling is not being dismissed here, but tired and exempt are two completely different things. What stands in the way does not soften because the effort to face it has gotten heavier. It does not extend deadlines because rest got skipped the night before. It applies the same standard regardless of how prepared anyone feels walking into it. That sounds harsh, stated plainly. It is also exactly accurate. The only thing that changes the outcome is whether the effort gets matched anyway, tired or not, ready or not. This is not about ignoring exhaustion. It is about refusing to let exhaustion negotiate the terms. The requirement stays fixed. Meeting it tired is still meeting it. Not meeting it because of being tired still counts as not meeting it. That is the entire deal, unchanged by how anyone feels walking into it.
Strength did not show up in a single jump. No overnight leap. No dramatic before and after captured in one frame. It came one night at a time. Quiet, repetitive, easy to underestimate from inside any single one of them. Every night added something the previous night could not have produced alone. Looking back at any individual night, it probably did not feel like much. Just another stretch of effort, another round of repetition. But the totals do not work that way. They compound, night folding into night, each one slightly building on what came before it. That is the part most people misunderstand about strength. It is not a moment, it is an accumulation. Anyone looking for the single night everything changed will be looking forever, because that night does not exist. What exists is every night, stacked, counted, adding weight to the next one. That stacking is still happening. Tonight adds to it too, whether it feels significant in the moment or not.
Genius gets treated like a separate category. Untouchable. Born different. Operating by rules nobody else has access to. That category does not actually exist the way people imagine it. Genius is just grinding that nobody noticed until it was finished. The grinding happened first, quietly, for longer than anyone watching realized. And by the time it became visible, it looked sudden. It looked effortless. It looked like something handed over rather than built. That illusion is convenient for anyone who wants an excuse to not start. If genius is just a gift, no effort is required to compete with it. If genius is just unnoticed grinding, the excuse disappears completely. The second version is the accurate one. Every result that looks like magic from the outside has hours behind it that were never magic at all. Just repetition done long enough that the final result looks like it skipped the process entirely. It did not skip anything. It just happened where nobody was paying attention. That is available to anyone willing to grind unnoticed long enough. Sleep does not build anything by itself. It repairs, it restores. It does not add new ground that was not already covered. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Leveling up happens in the hours that were not spent resting. This is not an argument against rest entirely. Rest has its place, but rest is not the mechanism that creates growth. It is the mechanism that allows growth to be sustained. The actual leveling, the actual gain, happens during the hours that got used instead of slept through. Every hour given to sleep instead of effort was a fair trade in terms of recovery, but it was not a trade that added anything new. So the gap between standing still and moving forward often comes down to which hours got spent which way. Not recklessly, not at the cost of collapse, but intentionally, choosing the hour of effort over the hour of comfort when the choice is actually available. That is where the actual leveling has always come from, not the rest, the hours that competed with it and won.
Pain fades. It always does. Sometimes slowly, sometimes faster than expected. But falling behind does not fade the same way. Falling behind compounds while the pain that caused the stall fades away. This is the trade that gets made constantly. Avoid the pain today, feel better immediately. And somewhere down the line, the decision to avoid it has multiplied. Other people kept moving. The distance between where they are and where avoidance left things behind has only gotten wider. That distance does not care that the original pain felt unbearable in the moment. It does not roll back because the discomfort that caused the stall has long since disappeared. Pain is loud and temporary. Falling behind is quiet and permanent, unless directly addressed. So the trade has to be made with that math in mind. Not what hurts less today, what costs less over the full distance. Most days, that means choosing the pain, because the pain ends. The gap it prevents does not.
Quitting used to be available. A real option, sitting there, tempting on the hardest days. It is not available the same way anymore. The body stopped offering quitting as an option somewhere along the way. That did not happen through willpower alone. It happened through repetition, training through the exact moments quitting felt reasonable, over and over, until the options stopped showing up automatically. This is what training actually rewires, not just muscle, not just stamina, the instinct itself. Where quitting used to be the first thought on the hardest stretch, continuing became the only thought available, not because quitting got harder to choose, because it stopped being offered as a choice at all. That shift takes time. It takes repeated exposure to exactly the moments that used to end things early. Every time those moments got pushed through instead of given into, the wiring shifted slightly, until eventually quitting was no longer part of the available menu. That is not toughness as a personality trait. That is toughness built through specific repetition, available to anyone willing to put in the same repetition. The gap gets explained away constantly. Talent, luck, better circumstances from the start. Almost none of those explanations are accurate. The gap is mostly just the hours that did not get put in. This is uncomfortable to hear. Talent is a convenient explanation because it removes responsibility. If the gap is talent, there is nothing to be done about it. If the gap is hours, there is everything to be done about it. Most people prefer the first explanation. It costs nothing to believe. The second explanation is harder to accept because it means the gap is closable, and closing it requires exactly what was avoided the first time. Hours, specific, unglamorous, repeated. The distance between any two people doing the same thing is rarely about who started with more. It is almost always about who kept showing up after the excitement of starting wore off. That gap is not fixed. It moves every single day based on what gets put into closing it. Today is one more chance to put hours into that closing, or one more day the gap stays exactly where it is.
Rest is being taken everywhere right now. That is fine. It is not a judgment against anyone choosing it. But while that rest happens, something else has to be happening on the other side. Other people resting does not pause the competition. This is not about resenting anyone for resting. Rest is legitimate, but legitimate does not mean universal. Not everyone resting at the same time means the field stays level. It means whoever keeps moving during that stretch gains ground that does not get given back. That is not cruelty. That is just how time works. It does not wait for everyone to be ready to use it the same way. So while rest happens around you, the choice is still available to keep leveling. Not recklessly, not without limit, but deliberately in the windows others are choosing to step away from. That window does not stay open forever. Eventually, everyone moves again. The advantage gained in the meantime does not disappear once they do. That is the entire calculation, not judgment of rest, just clarity about what happens in the time it takes up.
Talent was never going to be the equalizer here. That much is settled. Whatever natural advantage exists in the room, exists. No use pretending otherwise. But talent was never the only variable in play. The talent gap can be closed by a training gap run in the opposite direction. If the starting point was lower, that only changes how much ground needs covering. It does not decide whether the ground gets covered. Outtraining a talent gap is not a comfortable strategy. It requires putting in volume that talent never had to put in. It requires treating every session like it has to make up for something, because it does. That is not unfair. It is just the actual cost of starting from behind. And it works, repeatedly, across every field where someone with less natural advantage decided to simply put in more than anyone with more advantage was willing to put in. The talent stays talent, the hours stay hours, and over enough time, hours have a way of closing gaps talent alone never had to think about.
Destiny gets used as a comforting word, something that arrives, eventually, owed to whoever is patient enough or special enough. That word is doing a lot of avoiding for people who use it. There is no shortcut. There is only the long road most people are too afraid to actually walk. Destiny suggests something is coming regardless of effort. That suggestion is comfortable precisely because it removes the requirement to keep showing up. The actual mechanism is far less comforting. It is a long road, walked daily, with no guarantee of when it ends, no shortcut hidden somewhere along it, no special exit reserved for the deserving. Most people are not afraid of the destination. They are afraid of the length of the road required to get there. And that fear is reasonable. The road is long. It does not get shorter because someone wishes it would. But it does get walked by the ones willing to treat every single day on it as part of the actual work, not as a delay before destiny finally arrives. There is no destiny waiting at the end, just the result of every day spent walking instead of waiting. A limit feels permanent in the moment it shows up, solid, final, like something built into the structure of what is possible. It is not that. The limit is just where the effort stopped yesterday. That reframe changes the entire relationship to hitting a wall. A wall implies something fixed, built by something outside of control. A stopping point implies something temporary, built by a decision made the day before, reversible by a different decision made today. Most limits people carry around were never tested past the point they assumed was the end. They simply stopped there, tired, discouraged, convinced that the stopping point was the actual ceiling. It rarely is. Pushing past where yesterday's effort ended usually reveals more room than expected. Not infinite room, but more than the wall suggested. So the limit from yesterday is not binding today. It is just a marker showing exactly where the next attempt needs to start pushing from. Push past it. The wall moves every time someone actually tests it. Selection looked like the deciding factor from the outside. Whoever got picked, whoever got the opportunity handed to them. That picture missed what happened before the picking. Not being chosen did not end anything. It just meant the work had to start earlier. Being chosen looks like the beginning of a story. For some people, it is. For others, the story already started long before any selection happened. Built quietly, without permission, without waiting to be picked first.
That is a slower path, a harder one in some ways, but it produces something selection alone cannot produce. Proof that the result did not depend on anyone else's decision to grant access. Outworking everyone who got chosen first is not bitterness toward the selection process. It is simply refusing to let that process be the deciding factor in the outcome. Selection decides who starts with a head start. It does not decide who finishes ahead. That second part is still open, always has been, available to whoever decides not to wait for permission to begin.
Strength does not arrive as a gift. Nobody hands it over completed. No ceremony, no transfer. It gets taken from the only place it has ever come from. Strength gets pulled out of yourself one day at a time, not handed over by anyone else. This is uncomfortable because it removes the option of waiting for someone to provide it. Nobody is going to provide it. It does not exist anywhere outside of the person building it. Every day, that effort gets extracted instead of avoided, adds a small amount that was not there the day before. It is not painless. It usually isn't even comfortable. But it is the only mechanism that has ever actually worked. There is no external source for this, no shortcut that bypasses the extraction process. The extraction happens through repetition, through discomfort chosen instead of avoided, through showing up on the days extraction feels nearly impossible. That is the entire process. Not glamorous, not handed down, pulled out day after day by the only person capable of doing the pulling.
Every overnight success gets admired the wrong way, as if it happened quickly, as if it skipped the part that actually mattered. It did not skip anything. The overnight success was 1,000 exhausted nights wearing one visible night as a disguise. That is the actual sequence. 999 nights that nobody saw, followed by one night that finally became visible. The visible night gets all the attention. The invisible nights get none. And that imbalance creates the illusion that success arrived suddenly. It never arrives suddenly. It only becomes visible suddenly. The difference between those two things is everything. Anyone chasing the visible night without putting in the invisible ones is chasing something that does not actually exist on its own. The exhausted nights are not a detour on the way to the overnight success. They are the actual substance of it. The visible night is just where the substance finally got noticed. That is the part worth understanding before getting discouraged by how far away the visible night looks. It was never about reaching that night directly. It was always about surviving the 1,000 that come before it.
There are only two outcomes available here: leveling up or getting left behind. No neutral option exists. Standing still is just the second outcome happening slowly enough to feel like nothing is happening at all. The world does not pause while anyone decides whether to move. Everyone else is still leveling, whether the decision to compete gets made or not. That is the part most people forget. Choosing not to push forward does not freeze the field. It just means falling further behind it without realizing the fall is happening. This is not designed to create panic. It is designed to create clarity. There was never a version of this where staying exactly where things are was actually staying still. The ground itself moves.
Everyone on it moves with it, whether they intend to or not. So the decision is not between moving and staying. It is between moving forward intentionally or being moved backward by simply not choosing. Leveling up is not optional in the long run. It only feels optional in any single moment. Choose the level. The alternative was never actually neutral.
Shortcuts get searched for constantly. A faster path, a trick that skips the repetition everyone else has to suffer through. None of those shortcuts hold up over time. There are no shortcuts. There are only repetitions most people could not survive. What looks like a shortcut from a distance is almost always just someone else's repetition done somewhere invisible, borrowed temporarily, eventually exposed by the gap between borrowed knowledge and earned ability. Real progress comes from repetitions that get survived. Not once, not occasionally, repeatedly past the point most people quit. Survival here does not mean physical survival. It means staying in the repetition long after boredom, frustration, and exhaustion all argued for stopping. Most people stop somewhere in that argument, reasonably, understandably. The repetitions that get survived past that point are the ones that actually produce something. That is the entire difference between someone who eventually gets there and someone who does not. Not a shortcut discovered, a repetition survived that most people gave up on. Talent decides the starting line. That much was always true. Some start closer, some start further back. That starting line decides almost nothing else. Talent picks the start, grinding picks the finish. The finish line does not check where anyone started. It only checks who arrived and how far they had to travel to get there. This is the part that makes the whole system fair in a way that feels unfair at first glance. A head start matters at the beginning. It matters less and less the longer the race actually runs. Effort compounds. Talent without effort does not. So, the person who started further back but grinded the entire distance often finishes ahead of someone who started further forward and assumed the head start was enough. That outcome is not an exception. It happens constantly, because grinding does not care where it began. It only cares about how consistently it continued. Where this finishes is still undecided. Talent already made its decision back at the start. Grinding is still deciding everything that happens after it. Obsession got used as an insult, a warning, a suggestion to slow down, balance out, take it easier. That label never landed the way it was meant to. What got called obsession was just the only road that actually led anywhere. Everyone offering that warning had a point about balance generally, but balance was never going to close the gap that needed closing. Balance was never going to produce the 1,000 nights required before anything visible showed up. So the label got accepted differently than it was intended, not as a warning to heed, as an accurate description of what the road required. Obsession, looked at plainly, was just full commitment without apology. Full attention given to the one thing that actually mattered enough to justify the cost. That commitment built everything described up to this point. The door taken off its hinges, the 10,000 repetitions, the strength extracted one exhausted night at a time, the gap closed by hours instead of talent, the limit pushed past where yesterday stopped. None of that comes from balance.
It comes from exactly what got called obsession. Call it whatever name fits. The road only ever had one way up. Walk it, starting with the next repetition.